So let's talk about e-commerce and building the fastest digital storefronts. E-commerce is a pretty tricky problem set. I've worked on it for a couple of years before becoming a sales engineer here at Vercel. I've been here for about 9 months, but before that was building mostly e-commerce solutions using React and Next.js. Vercel is a great place to talk about e-commerce. A bunch of brands use Vercel and Next.js. So we kind of see both the code level and the infrastructure level. If you're new to Vercel, Vercel is a hosting platform for your websites. And we also build tools for developers to make better websites, one of those being Next.js. And that's what we're really going to focus on today. We'll talk a little bit about infrastructure too, but let's get into it. So to start, we're going to talk about the e-commerce problem set, some of the unique requirements that come up in e-commerce, and then we'll jump into the tech stack and some of those unique requirements as well. Then we're going to talk about some Next.js specific features, but these are really features you should be using regardless of the framework you're using. And then we're going to talk about why, like why are we focusing on all of this? What's important? And spoiler alert, the answer is the customer. And then we'll save some time, about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. We've also got a little bit of a live code demo of one of the more important new Next.js features. Like we were saying, e-commerce has a bunch of specific requirements. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this, right? It's just by its nature, very competitive. And with it being so competitive and the margins being so thin, we really need to design for the best user experience. Our customers, not only are we competing with all the other e-commerce brands, we're competing with running to the store and actually buying something in person, as well as all the different push notifications that we're getting on our phones. So we really need to be giving our customers the best experience we can. And the end goal here, right, is to serve more customers and increase our revenue, right? We need to really tackle each of these issues, both for the business and for the customer, right? You've got to improve your SEO. Showing up in the top of Google is one of the more important things for e-commerce. Search is a great intent that I'm looking to buy something right now. And if you're not paying attention to your SEO, being at the bottom of the page, most of those clicks go to the top 3 links in Google. So really important to focus on SEO for a discoverability standpoint, but also from a performance standpoint. Google has put a lot of focus on Core Web Vitals recently and making sure that customers are getting served a good experience. And so we really need to be paying attention to our page speed. We also really need to be paying attention to our bounce rates, our metrics. We've got to stay on top of those numbers. If someone's loading the site and it's too slow and they leave, that is a customer that we probably just paid some provider somewhere, either via an ad, or if they're coming in via organic too, all that hard work you've put into SEO, if the page loads slowly, they're gone. We also need to think about building features and experiences that allow us to grow the size of the cart and increase average order value. And so your application needs to enable those things as well. And then personalization. We can talk about this one in a couple angles. The one that everyone's familiar with is, internationalization, localization. And so, meeting your customer where they are is very, very important, both from a content perspective and from a language perspective. So this initiative, a lot of times at companies is due to, the marketing team not really being able to market. And that happens because the tech is sometimes getting in the way, right? So we need to have a solution that gets out of the way of the marketing team and lets them create specific content for specific customers and serve it to them. And so, these are all of the different important, business cases, but at the end of the day, performance contributes a lot to all of these. And I think something that's really important to note here is that it's not just performance in Lighthouse. Right? Google has been emphasizing the importance of Core Web Vitals, which are essentially collecting these data points from your customers out in the wild and actually taking that data and using it as the source of truth rather than some synthetic tests happening in Lighthouse. And so we really need to be paying attention to performance to really drive our business. And that needs to happen both after we've deployed to production and also before. Right? We need to treat performance like if performance goes down, then we've essentially broken production, right? And it takes a while to get to that state of mind because it really is a culture thing in the company. But a slow site is a broken site, especially in e-commerce. It's very difficult to make that site performant, right? Because e-commerce isn't static, and a lot of sites aren't as static as you think they are, but e-commerce specifically. We've got A/B testing or multivariate testing. You've got that market-specific content we were talking about. You need to localize your pages, add some personalization. When you ship new features out, hopefully you're using some form of feature flagging, and all of that is very dynamic. Also, e-commerce adds on an extra difficult layer as well, right? We're playing on hard mode here. You've got temporary promotions, which if anybody's ever tried to design a schema for temporary promotions and then add the corresponding promotion banner at the top of your website, you know how much of a pain that can be. Causes a slight layout shift and things like that. Then you've also got inventory. And if you're selling through a bunch of different SKUs at really fast rates, you're going to see that you need to address that in all of your different places throughout the application. Your price could change on you as you're moving through a checkout flow. And then just checkout by itself is a ton of craziness as well. So I think it's really important that we realize that e-commerce isn't static and that we need something that can address all of these different points. And so now that we've kind of talked about the problem set a little bit, let's transition into the tech. So I figured I'd just get my bias out of the way immediately. I'm a very big Next.js fan, and this talk covers a bunch of Next.js functionality. But largely the advice here, if you pull away from the Next.js piece of it, it's lean into the framework. There are a lot of great tools out there that exist, and we should use that. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. A great example, back in 2018, when I was kicking off an e-commerce project, I was working with a team, and we had decided to just use vanilla React. And we didn't use Next or any of the other kind of starter projects in frameworks around React. And as a result, we got a bunch of features completed. The site was ready to go. But then we realized we didn't have server-side rendering. We didn't have a bunch of really important things that are important in e-commerce. And as a result, we had to come back later and circle back and add server-side rendering to that existing application. And, it was a huge pain to do. One of my coworkers actually wrote an entire blog post about how complicated the process was. And, this quote, "Looking back, it is much easier to use a framework that already handles server-side rendering." That stuck out to me, and I've used Next.js on every project since. So I think this concept also applies past just frameworks too. You could say, looking back, it is much easier to use Intercom rather than building your own chat widget. Looking back, it is much easier to use XYZ instead of implementing it yourself. And I think that's something to lean into here. Just consider if there is an option out there that can handle the problem you're thinking about. Consider that, as engineers, we might be biased towards building the solution ourselves, when rather it would be much more efficient to purchase that SaaS or use that existing framework. And so, speaking of leaning into the framework, in the Next.js case of things, there is a component for that. In this list, this isn't a comprehensive list of all the things that Next.js can do for you, but it is my personal short list, especially specifically for e-commerce. So we've got Next Link probably being the best known component, and then also image optimization is really well known as well. Next Link is doing a bunch of things for you under the hood, right? I think if you were to implement all of the different features that Next Link has, it would take you quite a while, and you'd write quite a bit of code. And you could do that, or you could focus on shipping some of those more dynamic experiences to customers that we were talking about. If we want to increase, for instance, say average order value, there's a lot of experiences that you can ship that will help increase your average order value, and your team could be iterating on that instead of reinventing the wheel and using and spending time building next link or font optimization or thinking about your script loading strategy and things like that. Largely just use the framework where you can is the best piece of advice that I have. And we're going to cover image optimization, the script component, and middleware a little more deeply. So next image, it's the best way to think about it is the right image at the right time. Right image meaning let's serve the right format, so optimize when the browser can, and also let's serve the right size as well, and then give you a great loading experience as well. So in this demo here on the left, you can see we've got the cool color data URL is the background while the image actually loads in, and then the image is properly sized to the frame as well. So there are quite a few things that Next's image component can do. One thing to note is it does play nicely with whatever third-party service you already have. And then also, if your image is in source control, so it's a logo living in the repo or something in your public folder, you can import that directly into the code and set it as the source, and that will automatically optimize the image for you based on kind of where it's at. Another really important component is the Next script component. So e-commerce is full of third-party scripts. We've got tracking pixels, we've got conversion scripts, we've got user analytics, we've got event tracking. There are tons of scripts we're loading onto the page. Often these can be the culprit of why your page is slow. One thing that teams have done, and a nice pro tip here, is just monitor the size of whatever your third-party script injection tool is. So in this case, this is a Google Tag Manager script. Yeah, consider taking a look at the size of that for each new version that's published. But here we're setting this loading strategy to after interactive, which will help quite a bit with performance, right? We don't need to load all those third-party scripts before we finish painting the DOM and getting a good version of that page to our customer. So I think a lot of times we'll follow these onboarding guides that exist in a lot of these different SaaS tools or tools like GTM. And just by following those onboarding guides, you can get the script working. But I think it's important to always circle back and say, okay, is that actually the most performant way to be loading this? In Next script, we've got a bunch of different examples in our docs about Next script for commonly used tools. And so I think, consider using Next script anytime you think about adding a third-party script. The next big feature I want to talk about is middleware inside of Next.js. So, with A/B testing, feature flagging, those things we were talking about earlier, it's really important that we are still doing those things in a performant way. And middleware, prior to Next.js having support, was one of the most common reasons people would add a custom server. Custom servers, while they do enable additional functionality, they kind of get you out of the happy path of Next.js and should be avoided when possible. But that being said, if you do have a legitimate use case and Next.js does not adopt, it doesn't have an answer for your use case, then yes, totally use a custom server. But in this case, now you don't need that custom server anymore if the main reason you were using it was Express middleware. The best thing so let's walk through an A/B testing scenario here. Normally what happens is a request comes in, it hits the next application, and then the next application decides, hey, which bucket were they in? And then we server-side render the response back to them. When really what we should be doing instead is deciding at the routing layer where they should be going and then rewriting to that location. It's pretty easy once you think about what's happening here. Like in an A/B test, we only have 2 versions of the page, right? Why are we re-rendering that for every single customer? Instead, we could just continue along. We've got the 2 variants. Why don't we render it twice and then route to each variant based on whatever your A/B testing example has. So if you go to vercel.com/edge and then scroll to the bottom, there's some great examples of using middleware to implement A/B testing with a couple different providers here. We're looking to add more examples. So if you've got an A/B testing tool that you'd like to see added here, just let us know. The next concept that I think is really important is infrastructure as code, IAC, and infra from code. So Vercel just launched a integration with Terraform. And one of the reasons we think this is really important is we're ultimately trying to free up your DevOps team's time, right? They're a very busy team. They probably have a backlog as long or longer than the product roadmap, right? DevOps engineers are very busy people, and whenever we can take work that's been done once and replicate it rather than having to do that same work over and over again, that's ideal. We also don't want to be like clicking around in dashboards and configuring things. It's very prone to error and is outside of source control. So there's a bunch of reasons infra as code is great. And we definitely believe in it here on the Vercel team. It frees up a bunch of time, but taking that to kind of the next level even is looking at your code. So infrastructure from code and actually provisioning all these things rather than writing some YAML file or JSON file that says, hey, this is a serverless function, deploy it with this much memory and things like that. Instead, what if we could just look at your code and automatically deploy those things for you? And so that is what's going on with Vercel. So you've got, you connect to your repository, and then we automatically provision CI/CD for you. There's no configuration file anywhere that says like, oh, please configure CI/CD for me, and this is the shape of it. Same thing with our CDN. You automatically, based on what framework you're deploying, utilize our CDN. There's no additional work necessary. You don't even have to specify which serverless functions you want. You just write the API and include it in the API folder. And just like that, you've got serverless functions and they're deployed in the most efficient way. And this is true for the entirety of the Vercel platform, really giving you great defaults out of the box. And that's these layer 2 clouds do a really great job of addressing this problem, right? Ultimately, we don't want to be wasting developer time because we could be instead implementing features that help our customers. And one example of this working great together, the infrastructure from code, is incremental static regeneration. Incremental static regeneration is this great concept that's been around in Next.js for a while. The original version of it, the main goal was to give you dynamic content, but with static speed and static availability. And this kind of took an interval-based approach, say update the dynamic content at a certain interval. So a customer would come in, they would get served the stale page. And then if the time had expired, then we would generate the new page and then serve that going forward until the time passed again. And this is great for a bunch of reasons. It does something that's quite nice, which is it gives the developer more control of the caching strategy. And I think this is something a lot of teams focus on. Management might be calling this shifting things to the left. Really, it just means what can we bring earlier in the process? And in this case, we're bringing control of the cache into the developer's hands. And this gives you really good performance and reliability, but also a great developer experience. And recently, we rolled out as part of Next.js 12.1 on-demand ISR. So it's all the same things that are great about ISR, except it takes a more event-based approach. And so you've got the ability to purge the cache programmatically with an API endpoint. And when you're on Vercel, it propagates globally in 300 milliseconds. Take the same great concept of ISR and kind of link it in with your existing application. I'm guessing if you've got a pretty large e-commerce setup, you're probably trying to think about things in an event-based way. One of those things, let's take inventory, for example. You've probably got some sort of inventory service that is publishing event changes to some sort of queue somewhere. If we already have that information and we know that the page needs to be updated, why don't we automatically handle that? Why don't we automatically purge the cache and show the updated page? So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. And now is time for the live demo. On-demand ISR is what we're going to be talking about here. This is an example. So you might be familiar with get static props with the revalidate prop. On-demand ISR is simply removing that revalidate prop and calling an endpoint instead to do the revalidation. So if we go look at this Tailwind UI PDP here that we've deployed, so we've got this product detail page. This is using on-demand ISR, and then this page, an exact copy, except is using interval-based. And so let's go take a look at the code actually. So here's the interval-based method for get static props here. You can see we're generating some random numbers for inventory here. And then we're generating a price, and then we're returning those as the product detail. The revalidate prop here is set to 15 seconds. So if we go back over here and we're on interval and we refresh, you can see we just got that new content. I'll refresh again, new content, and it's going to stay 241 for approximately 15 seconds here. And then these inventory levels are staying the same as well. And just like that, now we've got the new content, right? And so this approach works. If you're familiar with e-commerce, you can already see some problems here, right? One, our cache is only 15 seconds. That's a pretty short cache. So we're not going to be getting huge cache hit rates. While 15 seconds is great for reducing load, if our servers were experiencing a bunch of load, we're probably helping out during spikes. But what we're not helping out with is the long tail of our catalog. If you've got a really big catalog, almost no one with a 15-second cache is going to be getting the updated page. And so a different approach you can take to this is jumping into the on-demand approach. So let's take a look at that. So here, this will remain the same until we manually revalidate with that API call. So we can refresh this as many times as we want, and we're going to get really good performance. And the information here won't update. But if we take this and we hit the revalidate endpoint, and then we get back revalidated true, which we can take a look at the code there. All this is doing is calling the revalidate on the home page and returning true. If that failed for some reason, we'd still serve the old version of the page. So we've revalidated now. And if we come back here, we can see, so this is the old, I haven't refreshed yet. And if we refresh here, we've got that updated content with the new price and the new inventory levels. And so you can see that this would be very useful if you've got an inventory system, a price system, anything that already knows when this page should be regenerated. And one thing to note, you are triggering a function that's running this, right? So each time you call that endpoint, you do want to be cognizant of how often you're calling this. So do keep that in mind that you're basically using a serverless function to run this. Or in the case of your Next.js application, you'd actually be hitting, if you're self-hosting this, you'd be hitting the pods with your calls here as well. So one of the reasons we do this is performance. We're actually, this is a Lighthouse audit that I had already ran, and we're getting really good performance out of this. And it's, I haven't taken any time to really optimize this. This is just a basic page using, we are using next image on this. So that is one performance optimization we've done, but it's a pretty great score for when you run page speed of .dev on mobile desktop here, we're looking at 100. And so you can see with this, we're getting really good performance. I think anything above 90, I'd consider pretty good. Obviously we want to shoot for that 100, but it's pretty hard to get on a Motorola G5 on slow 3G. Or Motorola G4, sorry. So that's a look at on-demand ISR. And the cool thing here, we're automatically pushing out to the edge for you here. There's nothing you really have to do. You're taking advantage on Vercel, at least, with all of these performance enhancements out of the box. So why are we doing all of this, right? Why do we care about performance so much? Why do we need to do all of these optimizations, and why do we need to keep them top of mind? It's ultimately for the customer. If you look at a customer's journey, they've got their first visit to your website, and acquiring new customers is really hard and really expensive. If we don't give them a great experience on their first load, they might not come back. They might drop right there. And depending on how much you're paying to acquire customers, that can be a really expensive performance hit there. And even if they do make it to the next spot in your funnel, if your product pages are slow or are missing some of the features they need, they might bounce there, right? So they made it a little further down the funnel, but they might not make it to checkout. And, speaking of checkout, we never want to break checkout, right? Including performance. I think checkout is one of the most important things, is to never stop people from giving you money if they want to, right? So don't break checkout. That's the number one rule in e-commerce. But I think the second rule could be, don't have a slow checkout, because ultimately what we're trying to do here is create repeat customers. If the cost of acquiring a customer is super high, then we really need to focus on getting them to come back and love us and be a promoter, right? We need people filling out that NPS survey with the highest score possible. I think there are a lot of times when we're making tech decisions that we kind of forget that it's ultimately about this customer journey. Sometimes it's easy to think about tech for tech's sake. A lot of us are engineers. We get stuck in the trap of thinking about, hey, how do I want to implement this? What tech do I want to use? Do I want to try out this new tool? Do I want to try out that new tool? The answer should largely be, is that what's right for the customer? And ultimately, these things all come down to an engineering culture. So I think while this was like a tech talk, and we went through a bunch of different engineering features, I think the most important thing you can do is focus on an engineering culture that really prioritizes performance and keeps the customer top of mind for all of the different, decisions you're making in your org, whether that be your framework, where you're hosting, your infra, what features you're building. All of that is super important.